What would you do if the voice of God asked you to destroy the very thing you love most? Not a stranger, not an enemy, your own child, born after decades of waiting, the living proof that your entire life had meaning. This is the question Søren Kierkegaard forces us to sit inside without escape for the length of an entire book, not as a thought experiment, as a wound. Published in 1843 under a pseudonym, Johannes de Silentio, John of Silence, Kierkegaard wrote Fear and Trembling in the shadow of his own broken engagement, his own impossible sacrifice of the woman he loved. Here was a man who understood, in his own flesh, what it meant to give up the thing that made life bearable, for reasons he could not fully explain to anyone, perhaps not even to himself. Today, in an age that demands we justify every choice with logic, data, and social consensus, Kierkegaard's insight feels almost unbearably relevant, that the deepest commitments of a human life are not rational. They cannot be. In our age of algorithms and self-help formulas promising a reason for everything, we might ask, what happens when the most meaningful act of your life cannot be explained to anyone else at all? Everyone knows the story. Abraham, told by God to sacrifice his son Isaac on a mountain. Abraham obeys. At the final moment, an angel stays his hand. We have heard this so many times that it has become furniture, a comfortable object in the room of our moral education, no longer capable of disturbing us. Kierkegaard's genius is that he refuses to let the story rest. He drags it back into the light and asks, what did Abraham actually do? He did not simply follow a rule. He walked 3 days in silence, his son beside him, carrying the wood for his own execution, and Abraham said nothing of what he was about to do. Not to Isaac, not to his wife Sarah, not to anyone. He raised the knife believing, somehow, impossibly, that he would still get his son back. Not through resignation, not through despair disguised as faith. He believed on the strength of the absurd that the sacrifice and the promise could both be true at once. Kierkegaard calls this contradiction the heart of faith itself. Not comfort, not certainty, a trembling, paradoxical trust that defies the very logic that makes it thinkable to us at all. Before Kierkegaard shows us the knight of faith, he shows us someone almost as rare and far easier to admire, the knight of infinite resignation. This is the person who has understood, fully and without illusion, that they cannot have what they want. Perhaps a love that circumstance forbids, perhaps a life that time has foreclosed. The knight of resignation does not deny the loss, does not distract themselves from it, does not pretend the wound has healed. They walk directly into the pain and make a home there. This is, Kierkegaard insists, already a kind of spiritual achievement most people never reach. Most of us bargain, distract, numb, or quietly betray our own desires to avoid the full weight of what we cannot have. But resignation is not faith. It is the last purely human motion available before faith begins. The knight of resignation gives the beloved up entirely and finds a kind of peace in the eternal, in the idea, in the acceptance of impossibility. The knight of faith does something Kierkegaard admits he cannot fully explain, something that looks, from the outside, almost identical to an ordinary person doing nothing remarkable at all. The knight of faith gives up the beloved completely, and then, by virtue of the absurd, receives it back in this world, in this life, without ceasing for a second to have surrendered it. This is not optimism, it is not denial. It is a movement Kierkegaard says he has never once managed to make himself, and he wrote an entire book circling the outside of it, like a man walking around a locked house. Here Kierkegaard makes his most dangerous move. He asks, was Abraham a murderer or a father of faith? By the ordinary standard of ethics, the standard that says the individual must always submit to the universal moral law, Abraham was prepared to commit a monstrous act. No court, no ethical philosophy, no reasonable person could justify a father raising a knife over his own son. Immanuel Kant's entire moral framework, in fact, would condemn Abraham outright. An act cannot be moral if its underlying principle cannot be universalized, and kill your child because a voice told you to is a principle that annihilates itself the instant it is generalized. And yet the biblical tradition calls Abraham the father of faith, not the father of transgression. Kierkegaard names this collision the teleological suspension of the ethical, the idea that the individual, in a relationship to the absolute, can find themselves in a position higher than the universal moral law itself, even though this position is completely unjustifiable, indefensible, and incommunicable to anyone standing outside it. This is where Kierkegaard's writing stops being comfortable philosophy and starts becoming something closer to a controlled detonation. He is not telling us that ethics is worthless. He is telling us that faith, if it is real at all, must sometimes stand in a place ethics cannot reach, and that this place is genuinely terrifying, not a loophole for self-justification. He is careful, almost anxious, to distinguish Abraham from every false version of this movement, the fanatic, the criminal, the person who invokes God to excuse cruelty. The difference, Kierkegaard says, is that Abraham's love for Isaac never once diminished. He did not become willing to sacrifice his son by loving him less. He remained a devoted father even as he prepared to obey the unthinkable command. Take away the love, and Abraham is simply a murderer. The love is what makes the story unbearable rather than merely monstrous. Perhaps the coldest truth in Kierkegaard's book is this: Abraham could not explain himself to anyone, not to Sarah, not to Isaac, not to Eliezer, his servant. He walked toward the mountain in total silence because the moment he tried to translate his faith into the language of shared universal understanding, it would stop being faith and become something else, either madness or crime, depending on who was listening. This is what Kierkegaard means when he says that faith is a paradox that cannot be mediated. It cannot be explained to the crowd, cannot be justified by appeal to shared reason, cannot be proven through argument. The individual stands utterly alone before the absolute, radically isolated, even from the people they love most. Compare this to Friedrich Nietzsche's later insistence that the highest human beings must eventually walk alone, beyond the herd's morality, answerable to no one but themselves. Kierkegaard arrived at a version of this loneliness first, though for him the isolation was not liberation from God, but standing directly, unbearably in front of him. There is something in this that speaks directly to a modern audience taught to seek validation for every decision, to explain ourselves endlessly on social media, to justify our private choices to an audience of strangers, to feel unfinished until our decisions are witnessed and approved. Kierkegaard's Abraham suggests something almost unthinkable in our current culture, that the most significant act of your life might be one you can never adequately explain to anyone, and that trying to explain it might be exactly what destroys it. We do not build altars on mountains anymore. But Kierkegaard's real subject was never really about ancient sacrifice. It was about the terror of genuine commitment in a world that constantly asks us to hedge, calculate, and remain reasonable. Every person who has left a stable career for an uncertain calling stayed loyal to a love that made no strategic sense, held to a private conviction that could not survive cross-examination by friends or family. Every one of them has stood, in miniature, where Abraham stood, not deciding between good and evil, deciding whether to trust something that cannot be proven, in defiance of everything reasonable people would advise. Kierkegaard is not recommending recklessness. He is naming something most self-help philosophy conveniently ignores, that the decisions which define a human life rarely arrive with certainty attached. They arrive exactly like Abraham's command, as a demand made in silence, offering no external validation, asking only whether you will move forward anyway. The society Kierkegaard critiqued, 19th century Christendom, had turned faith into comfortable habit, a Sunday ritual requiring no real risk. Our own society has built something structurally similar, an economy of curated certainty where every choice is expected to be optimized, explainable, defensible in a caption or a pitch deck. Kierkegaard's Abraham stands as a rebuke to both worlds. Genuine faith, genuine commitment, cannot be optimized. It can only be suffered. The angel stays Abraham's hand, Isaac lives, and yet Kierkegaard insists that nothing about the story becomes comfortable after this point. Abraham does not get to go back to being an ordinary father who was simply, briefly, mistaken. He has crossed into a solitude that does not fully close again. He has stood where ethics could not follow him, and no explanation will ever make that moment safe for the people who love him. This is Kierkegaard's final, unsettling gift. He does not offer a formula for how to become a knight of faith. He confesses repeatedly that he cannot make the movement himself. What he offers, instead, is a mirror held up to every reader who has ever pretended their deepest, least defensible convictions were actually the product of clean, communicable reasoning. Perhaps the real question Fear and Trembling leaves us with is not whether we could do what Abraham did. It is whether we have ever been honest enough to admit that some of our own commitments, the ones that hold our lives together, were never really rational at all. In the end, Kierkegaard's book is not about a distant, ancient horror. It is about the private mountain every person eventually climbs alone, the moment when love, conviction, or faith asks something of us that no one else can verify, approve, or fully understand. Abraham walked 3 days without speaking, not because he had nothing to say, because there was no language yet invented that could carry what he was about to do. What is the commitment in your own life that you have never been able to fully explain to anyone? The one you simply carry in silence up your own mountain? What is your Isaac?